So last week we talked a little bit about Exodus. We talked about Moses, and one week on Moses is enough, so we're just going to move on. No, we're going to continue talking about Moses. We're going to be in the same passage actually, so I'm going to recap a little bit about what we talked about last week, and then we're just going to continue in this same passage. There's something that I want to focus on in this passage, that I think is just it's just awesome. I think it's really life changing. And so we're going to focus on that, and hopefully that will change our lives today. I'm going to throw a little bit of a curveball to the worship team. I didn't ask you guys to do this, but then during worship I was like, man, it would be great if they did this. Man, it'd be great if you did this. Towards the end of the sermon, if it's feasible, if you guys could do No Longer a Slave again, I think that'll make sense as I'm preaching, but when you guys come up, if you could do that again, I think that'd be great. The title of the sermon today is Show Me Your Glory. And this is something that Moses says to God on Sinai. After his conversation with God, and God has decided to relent and remain with his people, Moses, not content with just securing the forgiveness and the blessing, he says, God, I want to know you more. I want to see your glory. I want to see you. And so I want to talk about that glory today. I want to talk about that interaction and really the result of that interaction. That's the main thing that I want to focus on today, is what did it look like? Because I can't tell you what it looked like for Moses to see God's glory, right? I'm just not that smart. But I can tell you what it looked like once Moses departed from seeing God's glory. Because Scripture actually tells us that. So I want to reflect on that a little bit. The background that I have for the slide, I know it's kind of hard to see, but if you were here last week, you remember we talked about the visible representation of God on the mountain. And how, when Moses is talking to God on Sinai and the children of Israel are at the base of the mountain, it is not as though God has left them. They have a visible, quite impressive representation of who God is right in front of them consistently, right? And so, in spite of that, they decide to create the golden calf, which is their own version of a visual representation of who God is, right? It's like they want God to be manageable. They want to be able to make him on their terms, not on his terms. And so they do that, and God still inhabits the tabernacle. They still build the tabernacle, and he still dwells in the tabernacle. And so that's what we talked about last week, and the fact that where sin abounds, what abounds the more? Grace, right? It's Romans 5:10. Where sin abounds, grace abounds all the more. And so, a lot of people phrase it this way: you can't out-sin God. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't leave him, right? But it does mean that you can't make him so angry that he leaves you. Now, you may decide to leave him, but he's never going to decide to leave you, right? And so we talked about that last week. Today, like I said, I want to look a little bit more at just what happens with Moses and God. So let's move forward here. Let's look at what God has done in general with Exodus, okay? So God has given signs in Israel to show his power. He's given them signs specifically in Egypt, right? The plagues, which are really a refutation of Egyptian religion, if you look at kind of how that's staged. And it's also sort of a decreation. If you look at the way it progresses and line it up with Genesis 1, it's as though God is saying that he is uncreating in Egypt so that he can bring his people out into a new creation. He parts the Red Sea to show his power. He provides for Israel in the desert to show his power. And he manifests thunder and lightning on the mountain to show his power. And all of these things are not just to show his power as though God has self-esteem issues and he wants to, flex and be like, look at how awesome I am. But it's just that he is actually that awesome, and he wants people to know him accurately, right? And so he wants to be able to display himself accurately so that they might understand him accurately. And really, the full purpose of it is that he could display to Israel who he is and display to Israel that he's willing to fight for her. If you talk to people in relationships or outside of relationships, and you just talk about the idea of relationships, it's wonderful to think that there would be someone that loves you enough to fight for you. That in spite of your stupidity, in spite of your obstinance, that there would be someone whose love for you outstrips your ability to offend them. And that they want to fight for that relationship. We want that in interpersonal relationships. Sometimes we don't recognize that we have that with God. That he fights for us, for our relationship, that we wouldn't run from him. And unfortunately, we still run from him. And if you look at how Israel responds to God's actions, just think about what they've seen, right? Think about like the background to that slide. It's kind of hard to see, but this is dry ground, and you've got Red Sea kind of piling up on both sides here, right? Sort of a visual representation of what the Israelites would have seen. Imagine seeing that, and then soon thereafter being frustrated with God. Like, how is that possible? Like, God could literally do that and nothing else, and you really shouldn't ever get frustrated with him ever again, because he at least did that. But he doesn't just do that, right? He provides for them in the wilderness, cloud by day, fire by night. Think about that for a moment. You're in the desert. It gets hot. What do you need during the day? Shade. So God gives them a cloud to shade them. Guess what happens at night? It gets cold. What do you need at night? Warmth. What provides warmth? Fire. And so by day or by night, God manifests his presence not just in a visual representation so they can see him, but in a way that actually provides for their practical needs. And in spite of having this, they still complain. They doubt him. They grumble. They complain. They consistently actually say, we should go back to Egypt, as though Egypt were a good thing, Like the beginning of Exodus, they're actually crying out to God, take us out of Egypt. God finally takes them out of Egypt, and they say, we should have stayed, right? And you're like, really? But if we think about that, that's how often do we do that, right? God does amazing things in our lives, and we forget the amazing thing immediately and start looking for the next thing, right? God, you did that, but what have you done for me lately? What did you do for me today? There's still obstacles in my way, right? The biggest thing that's happened that Israel, and then we talked about this last week, the biggest thing that's happened is that they've ignored these manifestations of God, and they've created one of their own. They want to make God on their own terms, right? They want to create the golden calf and make God manageable. It's interesting that they don't view the golden calf as replacing God. They view the golden calf as redefining him, right? They don't say, we don't believe in Yahweh anymore. They say, here's the golden calf. This is Yahweh, right? This is God. This is the God that brought us out of Egypt. This is the one that parted the Red Sea, right? And somehow they're thinking, this thing that we have made is now the representation of God. And so this idea of a representation of God is kind of a big deal in Exodus. And let's think about this for a second. If they build a representation of God, your inclination would be that God would say, you should not have a representation of me. You should just trust me, right? That's kind of the way that we think based on the way that we understand Scripture, the way that we sort of have always been raised. That God's response to that would be, no, you don't need a visual reminder of me. But let's look at what he does. This is Exodus 34 verse 29. And hopefully yes, okay. I was hoping that it wasn't going to wash out against the background, so I'm glad that's visible. So I'll just read it up there because it's easier to read than on my tablet. It came about when Moses was coming down from Mount Sinai. Okay, so he's up on Mount Sinai, he's coming down, and the 2 tablets of the testimony, this is the 10 commandments, were in Moses' hand as he was coming down from the mountain. And it came about when that was happening that Moses did not know that the skin of his face shone because of his speaking with God. And now this is kind of neat, right? That Moses' face is like beaming and different in some way. And as we'll see in the narrative, it's kind of scary. Like he has to put a veil over his face because the Israelites are sort of terrified at this shining from his face. But it's kind of interesting that in Moses seeing God's glory, he descends the mountain, and what does he become? A visual representation before the people. The people have tried to create with their hands a visual representation of God. And what does God do in response to that? Gives them what they want. On his terms, of course, but he gives them what they want. And notice the difference between what they created and what he gives them. They create a golden calf which can't do anything. He gives them Moses, who can actually interact with them. He actually does a better job of creating a visual representation of himself than they did. And we shouldn't be surprised by that, right? God's generally better at everything than we are, right? So we shouldn't be surprised by that, but that's something that it's easy for us to gloss over, that we don't recognize that Moses sees God's glory and he comes down not as, I'm not saying that Moses is God, but Moses, the shining of his face, is a visual reminder of God. We see something in Moses that the Israelites regularly are reminded God is with us. Look at Moses' face. The shining is still there. God is with us, right? God gives them the thing that they tried to craft themselves. This is radically different from what we think when we think about God. We tend to think that we disobey and God's like, I don't want you to have that. Most of the time, we disobey and God's like, that's not the way that I want you to have that. I have a better way for you to have that. And so please allow me to show you the better way for you to have that. Because when you make it, it's not going to work. It's not going to do what I want it to do. But when I make it, it's going to be precisely what I want it to be. It's going to be what you actually need, right? Because the golden calf isn't going to help them. What's that going to do for them? Right? It's going to sit there. They're going to look at it. It's going to be shiny, yay, shiny, right? But it's not going to do anything for them. Moses actually gets to interact with them. So let's move forward in the narrative here a little bit. When Moses had finished speaking with them, he put a veil over his face. But whenever Moses went in before the Lord to speak with him, he would take the veil off until he came out. So when Moses goes before the people, he has the veil. When he goes before Yahweh, he takes the veil off. Because Yahweh can handle it, right? God can handle the shining of his face. The people of Israel can't, right? They can't quite take what they're seeing from Moses. And so let's kind of unpack this a little bit. We're going to go back to the other background, the other visual reminder of who God is. What is the evidence of the covenant? When Moses comes down, what is the evidence that Israel is still in a covenant with God? We have two things. We have the tablets of the law. These are the legal documents of the covenant. They're showing you this is the covenant, right? This is, to give you an example, my wife and I are married. That's why I can call her my wife, right? I have two reminders that I'm married to my wife. One is my ring, right? In this story, this is sort of the Ten Commandments, right? What's the other visual reminder that I'm married? My wife, right? She's actually herself a visual reminder that I have a wife, right? Because she exists. Those are two things that I have to remind me that I'm married. And in the same way here, we have the tablets of the law, which are the documents of the covenant, but we also have Moses. And so the Israelites have this perpetual reminder, not only of the Ten Commandments, or not only by the Ten Commandments, but also by Moses, that they are in this covenant with God. You remember last week we talked about the marriage metaphor and how the covenant is essentially a marriage, and that Yahweh has married Israel. He has brought them out of Egypt so that he might marry them. And that's the covenant, right? And so they have this visual reminder that God has not left them, both in the Ten Commandments and in Moses. So God has not just forgiven them. He's given them precisely what they wanted. Let's put it this way. He's actually, this is going to sound crazy. He's actually answered their disobedience. Their method of disobedience was, we want a visual representation. That's how they actually rejected God, is by saying we want a visual representation. And what is God's response to that? Here's a visual representation. The thing that you used to reject me, I'm going to use to save you. I'm going to use to communicate to you. And this, we can see this throughout redemptive history. One of my favorite examples of this, just to give you sort of a tangent here, pardon me for going off script a little bit. If you read 1 Samuel, Israel, at some point, it's around chapter 14, 15, 13, somewhere around there, 1 Samuel, they reject Yahweh as king, and they want a human king, right? And they say, give us a king that we might be like the other nations, which is directly contradictory to what God has said about them. I want you to be separate from the other nations, and not only do they reject him as king, but they say we want to be like the other nations, right? God gives them a king, and eventually who comes through the kingly line? The Messiah. God actually saves Israel through their disobedience. He uses their disobedience to bring about salvation. They've said, we want to be like the other nations, we want to have a king. And he's like, okay, I'll give you a king, and I'll send my son as a king to save you. Because that's what you want, right? This is radically different, at least for me, from the perspective that I've always had of God, that he's like, I want it my way, and if you don't do it my way, then you're out of luck. No, he says, you want a king? You want to reject me as king? I'll give you a king, and I'll save you through the king. I'll honor your disobedience. I'll give you what you're asking for in the midst of rejecting me, and I'll save you through that disobedience. Think about all the mistakes that you've made. It may take a while for some of us, right? For me, we'd be here for a while. But think about how God has orchestrated your life so that those mistakes have actually brought you closer to him. He's actually used your mistakes, used your disobedience, used your rejection of him in his redemptive narrative to bring you closer to him, and probably also to bring other people closer to him. Because that's how amazing he is that he can use our mistakes to glorify himself. That ought to give all of us just this gigantic sigh of relief, right? Because the pressure isn't on me to be right all the time. Because even when I'm wrong, even when I am intentionally wrong, in rebellion, rejecting God, he uses my rejection to save people. Think about the story of Jonah. Jonah runs from Nineveh, right? Heads to Tarshish, right? If you look at a map, Tarshish is literally on the other side of the world as far as his perspective is concerned. Nineveh is in this direction, Tarshish is that direction, all the way on the other side of the world. In doing so, he gets on a boat with some sailors. Gets on the boat with the sailors, storm comes, he gets thrown into the ocean. What happens to the sailors? They actually start worshiping God. Jonah's disobedience to run from God's call in his life, God used that to reach pagan sailors who otherwise would not have heard the gospel, right? Would not have heard his message, except that God is awesome and would have used somebody else, right? But he uses Jonah's disobedience to reach these people. And so this ought to give us all like this just wonderful weight off of our back, that even in the midst of us screwing up, if I can say that in church, I'm sorry if that's offensive to anybody, I apologize. Even in the midst of that, God's using those things to save people. I mean, is that just like liberating for anybody? Like I can just like, it's not on me. It's not on me. It's not on my obedience. It's not on my self-worth or self-righteousness or awesomeness. It's not on any of those things, right? That's not to say you shouldn't be disobedient, but primarily you ought to be obedient for you, right? Your obedience doesn't affect what God's going to do in the universe, really, because He's that great. But your obedience does affect your relationship with Him, right? Anyway, long tangent. So God uses our rebellion to deliver us. He uses our rebellion to work in our lives. Israel wants a representation, and so He gives them Moses' face. He gives them the shining on Moses' face and the veil over the face as a visual representation always within the camp. God is still with us, because look at His crazy face, right? Look at this veil and scary stuff, right? Whatever it happens to be. That's a visual representation. He gives them the tablets, right? Later, Israel wants a king. We talked about that already. The question here that we're naturally going to ask is then, how does this work itself out in the New Testament, right? How does this work itself out in the New Testament? So, in the New Testament, who is our representation? Who is our representation of God's glory? In John 1:14, it says, the Word became flesh and tabernacled among us. That's not quite what your English translation is going to say, but they're wrong. It's hard to translate because you don't think of tabernacle as a verb, because tabernacle is a thing, and you can't make a thing into a verb. But John makes a thing into a verb. Like, he just takes tabernacle and he's like, that verb, right? Like, that's an action. Tabernacled. He pitched his tent among us. And he tabernacled among us, and we saw his glory. Glory is the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. Now, this is packed with Exodus 33 and 34. Because what's the word but the law, right? The law came down, became flesh, and built its tabernacle among us. That is precisely Exodus. That is exactly what's happening in Exodus, right? The law became flesh and built its tabernacle among us, and we saw his glory. That's precisely what Moses asked for, right? Lord, let me see your glory. John's like, we got to see that. We beheld his glory. Glory is the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. When Moses sees God's glory, God says, Yahweh, Yahweh, or the Lord, a God compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in loving kindness and truth. Abounding in loving kindness and truth, those words, if you were to translate them into Greek, which is what John is writing in here, it would be grace and truth. And so specifically, John is saying here, the thing that Moses experienced was just a foretaste of Jesus coming down to be with us. Let's think about what were the representations of the covenant with the Israelites. It was the law, and it was Moses. Moses was like the prophet among the people, if you want to put it that way, right? What's Jesus? Both of those things, right? He is both the law and the prophet among the people. Moses comes down with the tablets. Jesus comes down as the tablets. He is the law made flesh, right? But this isn't even the best part, right? Because we still haven't answered who is our representation. Because can anybody in here, and answer this carefully, literally right now see Jesus? No. I can't literally point and be like, there's Jesus' face, right? I can't see. So he's not literally our visual representation right now, right? Everybody tracking with me here? I hope that's not too heretical for you. I hope we're all on the same page here. So what is our visual representation? Let's move a little bit further in the New Testament. Let's look at, this is 2 Corinthians chapter 3. And we're going to skip a few verses. I'm just going to highlight the main points here, okay? And so 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 7 and 8. Now, if the ministry of death, chiseled in letters on stones, what's that talking about? 10 Commandments, right? Ministry of death, chiseled in letters on stones, came with glory. We just read about the glory, right? So that the Israelites were not able to look directly at Moses' face because the glory from his face, a fading glory. How will the ministry of the Spirit not be more glorious? Okay, well that sounds good. What does that mean, Paul? Because it sounds good, but I need more than that, right? So let's move forward in the chapter a little bit. Verse 12 and verse 13. Therefore, having such a hope, we use great boldness. We are not like Moses, who used to put a veil over his face, so that the Israelites could not stare at the end of what was fading away. We don't need a veil. Let that sink in for a second. We don't need a veil. Let's keep going. Let's see what else Paul has to say. We all, with unveiled faces, are looking as in a mirror at the glory of the Lord, and are being transformed into the same image from glory to glory. This is from the Lord who is the Spirit. We are with unveiled faces looking as in a mirror at the glory of the Lord. When you look in a mirror, what do you see? What do you see? Yourself. What is the glory of the Lord? You. Who is our visual representation? Us. God's glory in the world is your changed life. See, what he's saying here is we're looking at this and being transformed into the same thing. Are you completely and totally the glory of the Lord? No. But you're closer to being the glory of the Lord now than you were a year ago, or 10 years ago, or however long ago it was, right? And as you are beholding the glory of the Lord, you're being transformed into that day by day. That you are the visual representation of the goodness of God in the universe. That as you walk about doing whatever you do, you are His glory in the world. Your changed life is the glory of God. That is His reputation. What does God brag about? If God could manifest in front of anybody right now, what would He brag about? Look at who Ryan used to be. Look at who he is now. Not because of him, because let me tell you, he sucked. And still does to a large degree. But because of me, look at who he is now. I went to a wedding this weekend with some people that I went to high school with. And the girl who was getting married, I talked to her mom briefly, and she was like, "Now you're a preacher now, aren't you?" And she said it in such a way as to say, "Are you sure?" Is that a joke? Because that doesn't seem to mesh up with what I remember of you, you know? That's the glory of the Lord. Not because I'm awesome, but because look at what God's done. And it's the same thing with you. All of you have things that you can look at and say, I am not that anymore. I'm not that anymore. And as a result of that, you are a witness in the world. Paul elsewhere says that we comfort with the comfort that we've received. When you interact with people who are going through what you've gone through, you can be the glory of God in that person's life by saying, I've come through this. I'm on the other side of it. I, Christ in me, is the light at the end of the tunnel. What God's done in my life is the light at the end of the tunnel for you. I'm proof that God has brought somebody through what you're going through. And so you have to breathe this huge sigh of relief because literally the glory of the Lord in the universe is not you being great. It's Him being great in you. If you don't have anything to testify to, you don't have anything to testify to. If you're talking to somebody and the Lord doesn't give you anything to say to them, that's on the Lord, right? That's on Him. Maybe somebody else needs to talk to that person, right? The responsibility for saving the universe is not on your shoulders. Hallelujah, right? It's on the Lord's. And through you,